Okay, welcome to the fifth of our Foundation Year Program sessions. We are continuing tonight with Dr. Eli Diamond from Dalhousie University and the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who will be leading us through our considerations around Plato's Republic. I'm sure that I speak for many of us when I say that last week's session was most edifying, and so we look forward very much to what he has to say tonight. Before we get into the actual material, I'll simply remind you that this program is brought to you by your Urban Abbey, as well as the Center for Applied Theology. And I would ask you, if you have not already, to consider visiting the website of the Center for Applied Theology, which is simply www.appliedtheology.org.uk, and taking out a membership, as well as following us on social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and most especially signing up to our YouTube channel, where you can find these recordings and be able to review them should you want to. But without further ado, I will hand over to Father David Harris and ask him to get us started with the pre-recorded interview with Dr. Eli Diamond.
Dr. Diamond, once again, thank you for being with us. Incredible week last week. And we left off, let's jump right back in. We left off last week with your little teaser that you were going to begin with bringing, reminding us of the view of the individual soul and the parts of the human soul that emerges through this city-soul analogy that Socrates brings up in the Republic. And my specific question is, how is this different from the view of human nature that is assumed by Thrasymachus and those who view justice simply as the advantage of the stronger?
Right. Great. So that's one of the main ways I like to think about the Republic is that Thrasymachus and people who hold this sort of naturalistic view of justice, that justice is the advantage of the stronger, present a view of human nature which Socrates wants to refine and complicate. And so the view from Thrasymachus, remember, was this idea that real human nature, once it's no longer compromising itself to fit into expectations of political or social conventions, when you strip all that away, what you have is a basic desire in everyone that what everyone ultimately wants is to outdo others and to get as much as they can, right? That this is really what everyone's about. Weak people can't really achieve it. And so society has come together through a kind of compromise to protect ourselves from people who might just be able to satisfy this desire, that we come up with religious and political norms to restrain it. So basically that the main drive in a human being is to satisfy every desire without limit. And so the view of the soul that comes out of the analogy with the city is, remember that we grew the city from its very first origins, and there emerged an economic class, and then a military class, and then a ruling class. And the parts of the soul that emerge when we reflect on this analogy is something like this, that it is true that we have an appetitive part of us, appetites. These are the impulses or the desires in you for fulfilling the needs of your body. Interestingly, we realize that you might see that this is the place of the problem in human beings, that this is their endlessly acquisitive kind of imperialist direction. But that's not actually the case, because when appetite is actually just trying to find what the body needs, there's actually a kind of a natural moderation, if that's all that's happening in the soul. But as Glaucon said when he said in relation to the city that that's a city for pigs, that's not really a full human soul, because there's another drive or desire or energy in us, which we speak of as the spirited part of the soul. And so this, instead of having as its object, as the appetite does, food and drink and sex, this is rather the object of the spirited part of the soul is a little bit nebulous, but I think it's basically it's a desire for what is noble and honorable, and an aversion towards what is disgraceful or shameful. Now that's what that is going to be different for different people, depending on what their views of the honorable and the disgraceful are. But what's common in this energy is if you feel you are being disgraced, you're going to be full of anger. Or alternatively, if you think that you're being properly honored, you're going to get a kind of good emotional response to that. And so this is the emotional responses to really the norms of what is honorable or disgraceful to us. And then beyond that, there's the thinking part, which is actually the part that thinks about what is actually best, what is actually worst, and how should we attain what is best? What means should we employ in order to get the things that the mind determines are the best? But it's the mind that thinks there that's able to determine that. So in a way, I think we'll find the critique of the Thrasymacheian view of justice is that it's an overly simple view that really reduces the soul to its appetites, or even if that view of the soul is more complex than just saying we're basically our appetites, it sort of turns the soul upside down and says what's fundamental in you are those desires and drives to get more and more. And your spirit and your reason, your cunning, should be directed towards achieving those ends. So Socrates wants to show how the soul is more complex and then maybe turn it right side up, if we could put it that way, so that appetite, so that each of the parts of the soul is doing its own work, and the better parts, through common agreement by all the parts, are allowed to rule over the weaker parts.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Lucy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so it seems like when we get to book 5, a sort of seismic shift takes place. And the focus of the argument really moves. So my question would be, how is the argument different in the latter half of the text, in these latter books? And perhaps you could speak to us a little bit about the 3 waves of argument that Socrates identifies and addresses in book 5, where we get these 3 very radical, anti-conventional political measures being introduced. And maybe perhaps thinking about how these 3 waves move the overall argument of the Republic forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really a very big shift, and it's indicated in the text in the way that the argument sort of breaks off. They have a definition of justice, but somehow they don't seem equipped, for whatever reason, to talk about the relationship of what justice is to the various forms of deviation from justice. But the argument, it's interesting. We've been talking about how up until this point we've been working with this central conceit that the city and the soul have an analogous structure. And one of the really interesting questions I think to think about in relation to book 5 is, do we maintain that thought experiment of the parallel structure between the city and the soul, because it actually seems like when we move to the three waves of argument, we leave the soul behind and we actually just talk about political reforms that are required.
It becomes very practical, doesn't it?
What's that?
It becomes very practical, doesn't it?
It becomes very practical, exactly. So the way I like to look at this is, it is true, basically, we stop thinking analogically in relation to the soul. So you shouldn't be spending your time when the biological family is abolished. You shouldn't be thinking, okay, what's the correlate in the soul for the family? And when women are given the same education as men, you shouldn't be thinking, okay, what is the man in the soul and what is the woman in the soul? How does this all work in terms of the analogy? The analogy stops working. But it does not mean that this is not fundamentally still about the individual soul. I would actually argue that this argument about these political reforms is actually driving us more deeply into the soul to get a better sense in particular of the highest part of the soul, that is the mind or reason. And in order to do that, what happens, I mean, immediately the whole thing starts because Glaucon and Adeimantus have this problem that's been passed over in the argument so far. They say about the production of children, this idea that all wives and children will be in common, which Socrates kind of drops as if it's not an atomic bomb in the conversation, and they want that addressed because precisely it's so much against belief and against convention. And so what I think this argument's about at this point is, up until this point, the education was basically about training the soul so that its appetitive and spirited and thinking parts working together can be educated through music and gymnastic in their early training. Now the focus becomes on the mind in its own operation, right? The mind's own work, which we're going to discover is actually not just directing people practically, but we're going to discover that the mind has a power beyond that to think objects beyond the sensible world. So, so now what I need to do is to relate this to the three waves, because I don't expect this to be at all obvious how this is related to the three waves of argument. So see if I can make this at all intelligible and convincing. So the three waves of argument are these. They're called waves, by the way, because the idea is that they're so anti-conventional that, and increasingly as you move forward through them, that you're going to be bowled over by people's revulsion based on their conventional standards against the kinds of proposals that are being suggested. So it's the abolition first of the political significance of gender difference, so that men and women are all going to be given the same education, including the education to rule the community. And then second, that the natural family, the biological family of a husband and a wife and their biological children is going to be not abolished, as it's sometimes thought of, but actually extended so that the whole community will relate to itself as one big family, but as a result, those smaller families need to be dissolved. Mm-hmm. And then finally, the biggest wave of all, which is this outrageous idea that philosophers should rule, so that philosophical knowing and political power ought to coincide. And so, in a sense, what the first wave is saying is, the person is not his or her body, right? The person, gender is something that occurs at the level of embodiment. And the person cannot be fundamentally reduced or limited to that embodiment. And so it's a way of saying the person is her or his soul or mind apart from that embodiment. The second wave is saying that the person is not and ought not be limited to that naturally given fact of what family you happen to be born into. That mere natural basis for family has this kind of danger of giving yourself an extremely intense loyalty to a community that can then be opposed to the community of the city. And so that kind of given natural particularity has to be overcome so that the allegiance is to the city as a whole. So if you've ever read, for example, Sophocles' Antigone, the kind of struggle that can emerge between loyalty owed to family and loyalty owed to community, this is a kind of radical solution to that kind of tension. And then the third is saying that there's not an opposition between what is practical and what is theoretical, but rather that opposition needs to be overcome in the theoretical insight into the fundamental truths of the world. So I think of the key to these three waves is at 462a of Socrates of the Republic, where Socrates asks, "Is there any greater evil we can mention for a city than that which tears it apart and makes it many instead of one? Or any greater good than that which binds it together and makes it one?" Aristotle, Plato's student, focuses on this as absolutely key to all his political thinking. Goodness is unity, evil is difference and multiplicity. And so we have to get beyond anything that produces difference as opposed to unity. And so what we're doing in all of these is trying to dissolve this distinction between mine and not mine, whether that is my body and all my bodily historical experience, whether that's my family, the Diamonds, as opposed to your family, that we need this to have unity as the governing principle. And so just to close here, the reason I think this drives us more fully into the soul, what I was saying here, is we need to turn away from seeing the soul as simply bound to the naturally given basis of its embodied historical biological experience, born into a family, born into that body, and bring us more deeply into a mind which is actually able to transcend all of that. You know, you're not bound to a man's experience or a woman's experience or the experience of your family, that the mind actually has a transcendence which is able to see beyond that. And in a way, this whole section is about training the mind to that freedom from being determined by the merely biologically given character of the individual. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, fascinating. Thank you.
And worth hearing every word of. But after the three waves of arguments, Socrates lays out his three famous images from books 6 to 7, the sun, the line, and cave. What is the picture of the world presented in these three pictures?
Yes, so this is where it gets crazy, right? This is where the difficulty starts ramping up, and we have to be grateful to Plato, the author, I think, acknowledging that the difficulty, once we get into this metaphysical perspective of the world, is intense. And so we get pictures. I was saying a bit last day that my old teacher of the Republic taught me that this is actually, strangely, the mathematical section of the Republic, because just the way that a geometer draws pictures on the board in order to show proofs, but is actually referring to completely invisible realities and making necessary demonstrations based on them, that this is really what these images are doing. They're trying to give you visible pictures which will be able to lift your mind to realities which are not themselves visible. And in particular, these images come out of answering the terrifying question of what is the good? The good, which is really, for Plato, divinity, right? The first divinity. We might be able to think of this as both monotheistic and polytheistic, in the sense that we have a whole series of immortal, eternal, unchanging natures, which are all good. So, for example, the form of justice and the form of courage, what these are beyond the sensible world and can only be accessed by thought. And so there's a kind of polytheism. I sometimes, when I talk about this to try to make this familiar to classic students, I say, the form of wisdom is like Athena, but now divorced of some of those personal characteristics, in order to think of what the fundamental nature of wisdom, that is the standard according to which any wisdom in our sensible world is to be judged. You know, maybe the form of courage is like Aries, right? And then on this picture, Zeus would be like the good, that divinity that's able to gather them all together and hold them together in a kind of harmony. And so there's an acknowledgement that the question of what the good is a terrible question. And so what Socrates does is offers a series of images. So I have some terribly drawn pictures here that I'm going to see if I can share with you here. Screen now? That image? Yeah, great. So the first picture that's given is the analogy between the sun and the good. And so Socrates says, because the good is so hard to understand, let's talk about its offspring, the sun, not the S-O-N, which some of you probably also think about theologically, but the S-U-N, and the sun that you see in the sky. And he says, if we think about the role of the sun in our lives, we'll get a sense of the role of the good in the universe. And so he says, you know, between the eye and the colors that the eye can see, if that's all there was, there would never be any seeing colors or any seeing eyes. That you need a third thing, light, which is able to bring those together. In a dark room, neither can be united. And that light is not its own cause. And so the preeminent cause of light is the sun. And the sun is marvelous because it's not only responsible for the eye's ability to see and colors ability to be seen, but it's also responsible for the very being of those things. You know, so our eyes, which are sensible things, so they're always changing, and the colored things in the world, which are also sensible and always changing, their coming to be, their very existence as changing things relies on the sun, right? Its energy and its heat. And so both the existence and the ability to be known of everything in the sensible world owes everything to the sun. Says that's just like the good. Now, but don't think about eyes and don't think about visible colors, but think about your mind and think about truths which can be known, these Platonic forms or essences. And the idea is that if that's all there was, that there would not be knowing or being known. But there's a kind of intelligible light which brings these together, maybe reason, and that it's the good which emanates that light. And the good is not only responsible for the powers of our mind, to grasp the intelligible structure of the world, but it's even responsible for the very existence of our minds and of those truths. They're caused by it as its ultimate cause. Now, so that metaphor of darkness and light gets taken up in this idea of the divided line, and these are different ways of knowing the world and different kinds of objects that are known by those different ways. Imagination is the most primitive and passive way in which we know the worlds, in which images just flicker in front of you, reflections of objects are before you. It's really completely passive. We don't really contribute anything to them. But after many different images or sensations occur, we can start from that, starting to form beliefs about what things are. So we take the various images and we start uniting them, still in a very subjective way. But in that way, we can get some access to the sensible things which were behind the images that we were perceiving. Now, moving from the bottom two to the top two is a gigantic leap, because in thought and understanding, that's basically the modes of operation of the mind beyond the sensible. First, through a kind of mathematical thinking of quantitative objects, and then ultimately to the highest kind of knowing, which is called understanding in noesis. Sometimes it's also referred to as dialectic. And this is a purely conceptual reflection on the relationship between the unchanging natures of things, which should ultimately culminate in an insight into the good as the cause of everything, both of the intelligible world and of the sensible world, right? So that's impossibly hard, but we probably don't have time to tease it all out. But the different levels of knowing on the divided line, I think it becomes very real when we look at the image of the cave. I realize this looks a bit more like a sinkhole, but it's trying to reflect what the artist was trying to reflect was this idea in the description of the cave, that the cave was actually open to light, so that light actually penetrates right to the bottom of it, which I take it to mean that the good is not only operative in the intelligible world, but actually goes right down into our imagination and our beliefs. So no matter how far you are from the good is present and active at every level. So this strange image where we start off, our human condition is to be like prisoners, bound by chains and staring at images projected on a screen, and that we take that to be absolutely the totality of what exists. But in reality, there are puppeteers behind us that are actually projecting those images by holding up objects. And so I take here, I think the divided line is the best way to think about this image, that we are bound by simply sense perception and imagination as prisoners. And there are people who are making things appear to us in certain ways without us even realizing it. People who are constituting our beliefs and making the world appear to us in certain ways. So these are, maybe now we would say advertising executives and so on, but these are people who are influencers in our society. So authors and poets and artists and politicians who educate us, and our parents, and so on and so on and so on. And so there's a story of a Socratic kind of philosopher who will help us by cross-examining our unquestioning belief in those images, in those beliefs, who can painfully rip us away from these as exhaustive of reality and bring us slowly up to the mouth of the cave. And outside of the cave is that intelligible reality that we just saw. So I sort of map all three images here together, and you can see that the mathematical objects correspond to looking at animals and people in reflected pools. And eventually we can train our eye to look up to the stars and the moon at night. And those are the forms. And then eventually in the light of the day, we can see them in the light of the sun. And that is the forms now in the light of the good. So this cave image, remember I suggested to you the opening of the book is anticipating this cave image. When you look at this picture of Athens, the city up high, and then these long walls which lead you into the Piraeus at the bottom, you can see here that this is a kind of ascent from a lower part, which you take the long path back up to the city. And so I think this is the governing image of the book. Just for the purpose of your whole project here in your foundation course, I just wanted to read you the most beautiful lines of this whole book, which talks about the purpose of education. And this is at line 518, page 518, around 518b. And this is the meaning of the cave image, ultimately. Education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. And so the idea here is that all of these levels of knowing are already present to you. And what you require is just a kind of shift of perspective on what you're looking at, so that you can see more and more deeply its causes, not looking at only the derivative reality, but let thought lead you into a perspective that will let you see the entire essential reality of what you're engaged with.
Thank you.
So we've gone through a fair number of sort of what might seem sort of tangents to the bigger point that Socrates is trying to get to. And in book 8, we have this, what seems to be another beginning. We're going back to answer the question they abandoned in book 4 about understanding the form of justice in relation to the main forms of injustice. Now this is where Plato gives account of how the best person, the best political regime, the philosophical soul and the philosophically ruled state decline into increasingly degenerate forms, some of which will be familiar to us, things like democracy, tyranny, and Timothy and stuff like that. Could you give us some sense of what is going on in this section?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do, because the text here is so rich, and I think of all the parts of the Republic that help us think through our contemporary situation, this is the part of the text that's just so strikingly and immediately relevant. So I think rather than go through it in detail, I want to just give you kind of hints at what I think are the best way to work out this section. I'm just going to share my screen one more time here. Just one second. Yes, so these are the different modes of constitution, and I think that there are two ways to read their relation, right? So the first is the regime that Socrates has outlined, the aristocracy. Sometimes it's called the Callipolis because it's a polis that's ruled by the Kalon, or the good. So it's ruled by philosophers who know the good. In this way, it's not really the rule of people. It's a kind of, without the bad connotations of this, it's a kind of theocracy, because what we have here is a rule by the good and the forms, by these divine realities. Timocracy is the rule by the people who are the most honored for their moral virtue and often for their military victory. They're not intellectuals, but they're great, virtuous people. Oligarchy means the rule of the few, but in particular, the rich few, because in any society, the few are going to be rich. It's always the poor who are more. Democracy is the rule by the poor, and the fact is that the poor are always the many in a society, and it's a rule according to the freedom and equality of all to pursue what it is that they want. And tyranny as the rule by the most powerful simply according to their own private whims and imaginations and desires. So there's here's the two ways I suggest you think about how he goes through this decline. The first is according to the parts of the soul and the parts of the city and their corresponding virtues. So if justice is about each of the parts of the soul doing its own work excellently, then what you have in the aristocracy is all the parts of the city doing their own work with virtue. So rulers with wisdom, and a military class that is courageous, and an economic class that is moderate. And so in terms of the soul, someone with all the virtues, all those virtues of soul. What happens when you move to the timocracy is you cancel that top virtue. We no longer have wisdom, but we still have courage, and we still have moderation. So there's moral virtue without theoretical virtue, you might say. With oligarchy, we lose that moral virtue. All that's required now is that you have a certain amount of property, right? So it's what qualifies you to rule is that you're rich. But strangely, in order to be extremely rich, this might be a bit counterintuitive, but you actually need to have some control of your desires. If you don't have a kind of moderation, you're never going to be able to accumulate because you'll always be spending your money. So the rich at least have that last shadow of virtue, this kind of moderation. What happens in democracy is a complete erasure of virtue, right? A complete erasure of virtue. And if you think of the soul as horizontally ordered with reason on top, vertically ordered with reason on top, then spirit, and then appetite, in a way you're turning the soul sideways. So everything is equal to everything else. And nobody judges anybody's excellence or lack of excellence with respect to their thinking or their spirit or their appetite. And then with tyranny, instead of having a kind of horizontal equality, you turn the soul upside down. Appetite is what rules. Spirit and reason are working for appetite. So that's one way of thinking of this decline, as a kind of elimination of the virtues of the soul and then a slow turning of it upside down. But the other way that I think is helpful to look at it is to actually think of it according to those levels of the divided line that we were just looking at. And so what you have in the second regime, timocracy and the rule of honor, is the rule by those virtues, but apart from the insight into the good, right? So you have the forms without the good. With oligarchy, we have a kind of determination of who should rule based completely on quantitative or mathematical standards. So, for example, as an inheritance of your own House of Lords, in the Canadian system, the Senate requires that senators who are nominated have $4,000 worth of property, which is no longer so much. But this idea that if you're going to care about the community, you need to have some material investment in it. So these merely mathematical determinations, whereas democracy is a rule according to belief, with no longer any objective principles, qualitative or quantitative. And then tyranny becomes the rule completely based on private imagination and appetite. So you can also look at the 4 different regimes according to the 4 levels of deviations from the good on the divided line. Okay, I'll stop my screen share there.
So I think now would be a really good time to talk about democracy a little bit more, because Plato doesn't seem to hold democracy in particularly high regard, which is rather in contrast to the modern worldview, because nowadays we really do hold up democracy as being a kind of non-negotiable good. At the same time, we've got people around the world who probably feel that democracy is more fragile and vulnerable than it has been in some time. And despite the fact that Plato's Athens lived in a radical direct democracy, there really is quite a strong critique of democracy here. This idea that it's second only to tyranny as the worst regime, and that it's very unstable, and so tyranny is quite easily birthed from that. So why is Socrates so critical of democracy, and why does he see it as especially vulnerable to the emergence of the tyrant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's funny because there are moments in the treatment of democracy that give it a kind of striking praise. One is that it's spoken of as the most colorful and beautiful regime, and that can have somewhat ironic, kind of like a surface beauty as opposed to an inner truth. But it's also the only regime besides the philosophical one that allows for philosophy, interestingly. Not philosophy as having any kind of authority, but at least philosophy as a sort of private occupation that doesn't take its insights as binding on anyone else. Philosophy is actually able to be freely practiced in this city. So you have to think about those in relation to the critique. But, in terms of all these regimes, it's important to think that I think he's thinking about the form of each of these regimes, the essence of the pure essence of each of these regimes, and not any particular embodied reality, which is often going to involve some mixing with other forms. So, for example, our democracies, according to this description of democracy, would not be democratic, because there are people who are nominated to positions, judges who are nominated. Everything should be completely, in this form of democracy, based on nothing else but popular vote. And so the main values of democracy in this purest form are that freedom is the principle, complete freedom of speech, complete freedom to do what you want with your life, freedom to choose the life that you're going to lead, equality, so an absolute equality of every kind of life. So I don't judge your choice of life, you don't judge my choice of life. Every pursuit, every pleasure is equally affirmed. And so it's a kind of relativism we would speak of as essential to this democracy, and a total abolition of any distinction between better and worse, to the point where a family structure is undermined, right? There's no reason that a child should be under the authority of parents, or students should be under the authority of teachers. And so it's a freedom with absolutely no necessity or compulsion or obligation. You just do it because you choose to do it, and then you might change the next moment and completely change the course of your life. So freedom, individuality, difference, celebration of difference and change are the values here. But what that means is there can be absolutely no hierarchy. And the reality of that can become quite terrifying, because we don't, just because you understand medicine doesn't mean that I should accept your advice on, you know, how to behave in a pandemic, for example. No authority, no distinction between knowers and non-knowers, better and worse, is available here. And so as democracy intensifies, there's an irritation at any necessity at all, including the necessity to have to limit what I want because of tolerating what you want, right? So you can see how the transition here to tyranny is lurking the more that that privileging of absolute freedom intensifies. And so in a way, all of these regimes, they decline because somebody from outside looks at it and says, and discovers what the truth of that regime is. So for example, the non-philosopher looks at the philosopher ruler and says, wow, look at all the honor that they get. Honor must be the good, and that becomes the principle. And then those honored people tend to get more booty, as you learned about in Homer. And so you look at from outside and you say, wow, the good of being honorable is that you get all this stuff. You become rich. And then the poor look at the rich and they say, well, the good of that money is not that you save endlessly. The good of money is that you use it to be free. And so freedom becomes the principle. And then the tyrant looks at that democratic society and says, the good of freedom is power, right? The good of freedom is my power to do whatever I want. And I need to find some way to undermine the last bit of necessity that exists in a democratic society. And so you have this story, which is from the North American perspective, very resonant right now, where you have someone charismatic who is going to speak to the poor that the rich are exploiting them and that they can be a kind of popular hero. And so to overthrow any trace of virtue or knowledge or respect for anything, and then basically as a result of that start enslaving the entire world to private idiosyncratic imaginations and appetites. And the whole society basically becomes an instrument of the fulfillment of that imagination.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, there's lots more we could say there. But
if Trump doesn't make the second presidential debate, I'm going to request that you are there instead of him, just to give the American people a little political theory. It might be really helpful.
Right.
Just to bring, we have about 6 or 7 minutes, just to bring, at this point, it's easy to forget that the way we got into all of this political stuff is that we began with a discussion of the human soul. And that all of this political stuff, in a sense, was an analogy for us to examine the soul. Now, most of us think of the Republic as, you know, one of the most important texts in maybe political philosophy or something. What do you think is what's really going on between, is Plato going for the idea of justice in the soul, or is he trying to give us a recipe for how to establish justice in society? Or are they inseparable? What's going on?
Yeah, so you would not be without justification to read the Republic as not political at all, as surprising as that can sound. Because when you look at that initial conceit of the analogy between the city and the soul, the only reason we started looking at the city is so that we could get a view into the individual soul. And in fact, later Neoplatonic authors, I see in your curriculum that you'll be treating some of those later, read this work very strictly in this way, that this is all an education about the soul. The politics is allegory, right? I would argue against that view, because I think one of the things that the work shows very seriously is that for the soul to develop and flourish into its full potential and to realize all of its nature, that it relies on a community and the education that the community gives it. And so just as, when he speaks about the tyrant, he says, the worst thing for a tyrant, for a tyrannical soul, is to live in a society that actually allows it to establish a tyranny. The best thing for it would be for the tyrannical soul to be in a community that keeps it in check because of its own virtue. I think the same thing here could be said from the perspective of the philosopher, that the best thing would be that if you could have a philosophical soul that lives in a community that could actually bring out the outer conditions so that the community could actually be governed according to the good and the forms known by the philosopher. That's best. And in that sense, the political argument is real. But I think that nonetheless, Plato lived in a time of huge cultural upheaval and disintegration that he was responding to. And I think in this sense, the argument of the Republic is also an apolitical guide for those who find themselves in political circumstances where the idea of founding a just and philosophical city is outrageous. And in fact, trying to bring it about would just involve persecution that would be absolutely futile. And so Glaucon says this is at 592. I always love to read this out, although it's a bit dangerous because sometimes I cry when I read it. So hope that doesn't happen. Glaucon says of the philosophical and completely virtuous individual, he won't be willing to take part in politics. And Socrates says, yes, by the dog, he certainly will, at least in his own kind of city. But he may not be willing to do so in his fatherland, unless some divine good luck chances to be his. And Glaucon says, I understand, you mean that he'll be willing to take part in the politics of the city we were founding and describing, the one that exists in theory, for I don't think it exists anywhere on earth. And Socrates says, but perhaps, I said, there is a model of it in heaven, for anyone who wants to look at it and make himself its citizen on the strength of what he sees. It makes no difference whether it is or ever will be somewhere, for he would take part in the practical affairs of that city and no other, right? So there, see, it's for anybody in any political situation, because it can always be used to disclose a kind of eternal model for what the soul ought to be, which is very difficult to realize without a community helping to educate you and helping to support you. But it nonetheless, in a way, is the only kind of hope for someone with a philosophical soul, with an orientation towards the good. This gives a kind of philosophical guidebook for how that person could still flourish despite living in a terrible time and in a terrible place.
Eli, thank you for that. I know, especially based on last week's response, that I'm speaking for more than just myself when I say it's been an absolute privilege listening to you on this. I know also that there are so many more questions that are on all of our minds. The only regret we have at all is that we will be left to our own devices to try to sort of find our way forward in response to some of those questions. But what a delight, and thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation. And I received a a nice note from someone asking a question, so people can always feel free to contact me if they have if they run up into questions while they're studying Republic.
Good. We're now back together, I think, and now is the time to ask questions. I hope that everybody watching notices that I wore the same outfit tonight as I did yesterday for continuity's sake, once this video goes up as a single whole. In any case, what we'll do in terms of questions is I'll just ask Father David, Lucy, and Daniel to help me sort of scan the crowd. And if you have a question, indicate it either by just unmuting yourself and asking it, or raising your hand, making some kind of visual indication. Are there any initial questions that we can try to handle? And please don't be shy, because you're not going to be stuck with Father David's and my amateur attempts at answering. We do have on hand Father Tom Plant, who is who lives intellectually in the same world inhabited by Dr. Diamond. So we're privileged again.
While people are thinking of questions, I'd be interested in Father Plant's response to Dr. Diamond. Any kind of highlights that you'd want to call attention to?
I can unmute myself. I note that Gianni does have his hand up, but otherwise, yes. But there was a hand going up there if you wanted to take that first, Father. Up to you.
Yeah, let's go to G.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. I was just wondering, does Plato ever touch on, like, is there a point to the physical world, given that he doesn't think it's very good in relationship to the forms and that kind of thing, and that we are our soul, like physical creatures particularly? Does he ever, like, answer that?
Yeah, I lost you towards the end, but what I think I heard was, is there any point in the actual, what we consider the physical world, given the realm of the forms?
Yeah, does he ever actually? Yeah, does that question ever come up? Or...
In Plato himself, can't answer, but in Neoplatonist tradition, certainly, and there are various responses really, and one is simply that the good is of such a nature as to generate the forms and thereby the physical world. There's a certain inevitability to it, and thereby it becomes almost a non-question. You could look at the myth of air, I suppose, at the end of the Republic, and see the world as essentially the platform for the transmigration of souls, and therefore for the return of the manifest multiplicity of beings to its original source in the one and the good. And you've got that Platonic, or particularly Neoplatonic, theme of procession and return, all things emerging from the unitive source in order to return to it. And that really being the purpose of being. Now, I think it takes a bit of Christian, or for that matter, Muslim or Jewish theism in there to establish the nature of the good as love, and to give a real reason for that emanative creation. But of course, Plato doesn't.
Gianni, you might be interested in a short paper I've written, which kind of touches on what you're raising. So I don't think it's something that Plato necessarily makes explicit. However, from the text, you really can infer that because the forms are intelligible, and yet in the text, the characters, particularly Socrates, constantly fall back on spatial and sensible language. There are lots of references to, looking, seeing, moving towards, turning, which rather suggests that, okay, the forms are intelligible, they're not physical, but there's something about the human mind which naturally seeks to make things sensible and to draw them into the sensible. And so what you could really argue, and what I have argued, is that, and I'll post the paper perhaps on the Old Wine group if you're interested, is that forms invite embodiment, and they almost ask us as human beings to make them incarnate. And so by understanding this, we can really get an appreciation of what it means to be human. I don't know if that's helpful.
But what well, I obviously haven't read the paper or anything, but like,
No.
what it means to be human in Plato is to be a soul, right? Like, we're no less human but by losing our bodies.
That's right.
I don't know if that's true.
Go on, Father.
Well, I think Lucy's really onto something, that and for the plant, realize that with the kind of Platonic view of the world, we're kind of in a way, we're at the edge of being, where things are fragmenting into non-being, and the whole kind of what Lucy is calling the kind of incarnation of the good, I think is fundamentally what this whole kind of journey is about, and why I think Augustine was so taken with the Platonic vision, that it is so well linked with the idea of incarnation, that despite of all the chaos around us, the good is still somehow incarnated into being, into this world of change.
And on this, Platonism is bigger than Plato necessarily. Plato himself, in his sprawling range of dialogues, isn't consistent in every respect. There are different Platonisms and different emphases. And certainly by the time you get to Iamblichus, Syrian priest who adopted an Egyptian name, you've got this non-dualistic strand of Platonism in a certain contrast to Plotinus's more rationalistic, arguably more dualistic view, although that is disputed. And I know that Plato's commonly portrayed as a dualist, as though the soul is all that matters and the body essentially doesn't, but that's not the whole story. There's an entire very influential strand of Platonism that would, in Iamblican theology, certainly argue that the universe, the material realm, is in a sense an incarnation of the universal soul. But that's picking up on different strands of Plato from the Republic, and in particular it's drawing on the Parmenides and the Timaeus. Timaeus, well worth a read after the Republic, because it's essentially a sequel to it, but with a little different nuance, especially on the good, well worth looking at. It may help to answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Can I do a quick scan for any other questions? Not seeing any. David, do you want to follow through with what you had first raised with Father Thomas?
Well, just, realizing that probably, well, 100% of us probably are practicing Christians. And clearly, for Dr. Diamond has been fired up from inside. And this is my own experience of reading Plato and Plotinus, that it's not just this kind of theory. It really fires up your way of looking at the world. And as somebody who's read far more of this than I have, what's your kind of takeaway from Dr. Diamond's, because it was on many levels, it was so practical in our experience of the world.
I mean, I certainly don't have the expertise of Dr. Diamond. Let's not pretend that I do. And my interests are perhaps more towards the Neoplatonic, and so that's probably why I side a little more with the Neoplatonists. I know that Dr. Diamond. I wish he were here so I could ask him questions myself, because I've got questions I really want to ask him. He sees the Republic as a blueprint for an actual sort of city-state. And I find that interesting. It has been applied. I think I've mentioned last time that it was attempted to be applied in the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's a model of it. And of course, Karl Popper protested against it as in his book Enemies of the Open Society, Plato as an advocate against Socrates, sort of misusing Socrates as an advocate of a totalitarian state. Now, I think that there are problems with that view, certainly. I don't think that the Republic would be the ideal place to live. But I must say, I'd like to ask Dr. Diamond about the end of Book 9, the bit that he raised, where Socrates says, well, in a way, it doesn't matter that this doesn't exist in the world. It does exist. because the forms, the ideas are real. In fact, they're more real, aren't they? So this is almost the Republic is a republic, or arguably a monarchy, in which we can all live in our hearts and in our spirits. And indeed, the philosopher will not get involved at all in political affairs in any existing regimes as they are, but only in this ideal regime, which is a kind of heavenly kingdom. I think there are interesting, that I'd like to explore that further, really. I'm interested in the whole gender thing as well. I can see that there was a great challenge. Socrates and Plato were presenting a huge challenge to gendered roles in Greek society at the time, and they were looking to Sparta, where men and women did exercise together naked, etc. But on the other hand, it seems to me that to say that there's a kind of ungendered soul, I don't know. I mean, I need to explore it further, but Plato is quite clear in the Republic that, or Socrates anyway, that women are basically not as good at things as men. He says that explicitly. Then he goes on in the Timaeus to say that actually women are, they're men who were reincarnated, who chose to be women. There were no original women, they're defective men. And in the Symposium, it's Aristophanes, who you might remember, took the mick out of Socrates quite badly in some of his plays, including The Clouds. Aristophanes puts forward this was it comical? We don't know. Or was it sort of serious idea that at the beginning of time, there were these sort of circular man-woman androgynes with 8 limbs rolling around the place. And they were so powerful that they risked overthrowing the gods. So Zeus cut them in half and thereby made man and woman. And so true love is for man and woman to find one another and be reunited. And Plato, dismisses this idea of an androgynous, unified soul. He dismisses Aristophanes and possibly is ridiculing Aristophanes for having ridiculed Socrates. So I don't know about that. I'm not sure that Plato speaks quite so well to modern sensibilities about gender equality. In many senses, in many ways, he is still of his time.
What do you make of at the end the quite emotional reading from Republic? That all of us, and from before when he talked about the definition of education, Socrates seems to say, and Dr. Diamond seemed to say, that all of us have this capacity to turn toward the good. I wonder about that when I think about my grandmother, who was such a simple woman. Did she really have the capacity to in a philosophical way, turn toward the good? What do you think Dr. Diamond and Plato mean about every one of us has this capacity to participate in this world where the light of the good actually shines upon us and lightens our path?
Difficult, isn't it? Difficult to square that with the Republic if that is taken as a genuine blueprint of society, and if we genuinely think that some people simply do not have the capacity to become the philosopher kings and the ruling class and so on. That's difficult to square. On the other hand, the other angle is that it's a matter of recollection. Memory is a great part of the Platonic doctrine of the soul, as indeed is reflected in the Odyssey, actually. This sense that we are not blank slates a la Rousseau or Locke. We're not a kind of blank hard drive when we're born, being waiting to be filled with goodies and being corrupted by society, but rather intrinsically we have come from the good. We have an intrinsic memory of the good that is there to be reawakened, and that is within all. Now, how you square those things together, I think would be a question I'd love to ask Dr. Diamond, because I don't know how Plato does it, but well worth thinking about. I mean, I know how some Neoplatonists do it, because Iamblichus certainly does it through theurgy. So it's through ritual and liturgy, which awakens these aspects in one's soul and then leads one to the good. But Plato's own Republic view of it does seem, taken at face value, to be an elitist one. I can't see a way around that, but maybe other people can.
In the analogy of the cave, he says that the philosopher kings, despite having left the cave, if they're true to their purpose, will go back into the cave and suffer alongside the others and try and draw them along the same path, or not necessarily on the same path, but help them to understand where they are.
Indeed, and in the process probably get killed for it.
Yeah.
You know, which of course has enormous resonance for Christians, doesn't it? You know, the word descends from the Father and is crucified.
We have a number of points like that where, so there's one point earlier when, is it Glaucon describes, it says that this just man will just end up being scorned and eventually he uses specifically the word, he says scourged and then crucified. And then also on this particular point you mentioned just there, he then also talks about this just man will come down to to common folk like perhaps me and a lot of other people who are still down there in the cave, blind and whatever else, and then we'll all treat him like a scoundrel and attack him. We had a talk at Pusey House by a chap called James something or other. I think you know him, Father David. It was about C.S. Lewis and the Neoplatonists, and he was saying that he, perhaps over dramatically, that Plato predicted Christ. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Is that a question to me or to Father Harris? Sorry,
I think that was to you, Father Platt.
I see. Well, you know, good grief. As a Christian, I certainly believe in divine providence, and I suppose the kind of very Neoplatonic kind of Christian that I am. Yes, I see the good as not being the exclusive providence of the Church. So to find foreshadowings of Christ in the Odyssey, in the Aeneid, in the works of Plato, and indeed further afield, doesn't leave me particularly askance. Any more than to find it in the suffering servant of Isaiah.
The other thing, reading the Republic, Plato talks about the good is the thing that the good is the thing that we're yearning for, and it's kind of the source of all of our it's the source of sort of our feelings of emptiness inside, because this is the thing we're after. It's the thing that we once knew, this thing in perfection, and now by drinking the waters of forgetfulness, or whatever they're called, we're given this body, and then we're lost from this. We're lost from the perfect vision of the good, and this is why we feel all these yearnings and despair. But it seems what Plato or Socrates is arguing is that the only way we will properly ever get back to the full vision of the good is to die. We can't have the full vision of it here. I don't know, is there anything you have to say on that?
The sort of beatific vision, almost, to give it some later language. Yeah, I mean that's right here, where he discusses the highest form as the good. Yet he also elsewhere in the Symposium and the Phaedrus describes the highest form as beauty, which is perceptible here. through love, essentially, through erotic longing, eros, for beauty. And this again is a theme which Neoplatonists will take up. To what extent should the good and the beautiful be identified as the same form? For Plotinus, the beautiful is in some way lower than the good. It's what leads one to the good, but the good is beyond being and beyond even beauty. For Proclus, and then for the Christian who called himself Dionysius, the good and the beautiful can be simultaneously the same thing in actual instantiations. For Dionysius, the good and the beautiful are one. And therefore, the good, by its beauty, by being the beautiful, draws one in this world towards it. And Dionysius will draw Jewish tradition into it and take Moses as a type of the bishop, suggesting that the celestial hierarchy, but such that Moses and those who follow in his steps liturgically, as it were, can arise to the unknowing of that which is beyond being. And I should probably just say a brief note there, actually, in the Republic, while we're at it. It's in 509 book 6, about the good. There's this sense, Plato in the Republic gives this sense that the good is somehow beyond being. And this is something the Neoplatonists will pick up on hugely, make a great deal of. So there's a question of whether whether the good is something that we can know, or whether it is rather something to be attained to through a kind of divine unknowing that leads even beyond intellection. Plato per se is inconclusive. The Platonist tradition will draw that out further.
One last question, because we have about 5 minutes left. I found it fascinating because Socrates, in a way, sounds like St. Paul, and Dr. Diamond brought it out so explicitly. And people watching this and people who have are cynical about watching this think, philosophers, it's all about the head. You're thinking about all these ideas, they have no practical reality. But Socrates makes it very clear that to look toward the good is not to turn the head, but to turn the whole body. And Dr. Diamond brought out that this is whatever this means, this turn toward the good, it is not simply a cerebral thing or just a base intellectual thing. It is a turning of the whole of our life toward the good.
Yeah,
Elaborate.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, absolutely. And Plato inverts that whole polarity of knowledge and opinion on which so much very exceptionalistic Western thought seems to be based. The idea that we can only know anything through empirical testing of hypotheses, through science, in other words. Well, that falls within the realm of doxa, the third bit on the divided line below. That's in the lower half for Plato and Socrates. It's simply not enough. The classic empirical case of you want to establish that swans are white. You see 100 swans, they're all white, so you say all swans are white. Then along comes a black swan. What do? Redefine swans, or you've only got probability with empiricism. Obviously that's the case. And mathematics, etc., they are not based on empirical knowledge. They are a priori. And so, this is far from absurd to say that we should rest true knowledge on what is a priori, what is permanent, what is lasting, and what is not merely subject to the flawed evidence of the senses, and indeed to change. So, yes, body and mind are necessary for knowledge, partly because it is the realm of the senses that is derivative of the eternal laws and not the other way round. And I think it's a great failure in modern Western thought, a very narrow-minded way of looking at things, to claim the opposite, given our obvious Platonic inheritance.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any last pressing questions? If not, thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to Father James and Kat for supporting this and for making this happen. And next week, is it next week, Lucy?
Well, when you tell me what it is.
Well, I know we're having a break soon because of break in term, but maybe not this week.
That's later. That's later.
Okay.
No, it's next week. We're doing Aristotle.
Yes, the Nicomachean Ethics. Yes, if Plato.
I got money off my copy because it was ripped, and explained to the lady in Waterstones that I hadn't ripped it myself.
Yes, if Plato didn't blow your mind, Aristotle will. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Father Plant, for being with us.
A great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you all next week.